My name is Anita Beck, and I'm a retired public school educator from Worthington. I am excited to be here today, not only because I'm a proud FitzGerald supporter, but also because for the last 37 years I've seen firsthand in the classroom the difference pre-kindergarten can make for students and their families when they arrive at our school's front door. As a first grade teacher at Brookside Elementary in Worthington, I saw many children struggle with basic language or social skills because they did not have access to early childhood education. For too many families all across Ohio, the cost of those preschool programs was out of reach. Instead, parents' only options might be to put their 4-year-olds in slightly less expensive or crowded daycare centers, or possibly entrust them to the care of neighbors or overburdened family members. Some children showed up to school with a clear disadvantage in their readiness to learn based on their home environment. Those are the students who often fall behind their classrooms right from the start. Young children need that confidence in themselves to nurture a lifelong love of learning. Sometimes it takes years with additional intervention support for children to catch up with peers who've had the advantage of preschool experience. But I'm not just speaking from 37 years of classroom experience. I have a degree in early childhood education, which gave me specific training in child development, and I spent my teaching career focused on the learning patterns of young children ages 4 through 9. Again and again, studies show that universal pre-K can make the difference between a dropout and a valedictorian. It's that simple. It's the best and most cost-effective investment that we can make in our schools. And as a parent, I know this plan will make a difference for Ohio's families, reducing costs in childcare, ensuring parents are invested in their children's education from an even earlier age. Universal pre-K is the right investment for Ohio's children, teachers, families, and economy. So I'm proud to be here today as a mom and a career public school educator to support and introduce the man who can make a difference for Ohio's schools, family, and economy, the next governor of Ohio, Ed FitzGerald.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's okay. Well, first of all, Anita, thank you very much for a very nice introduction, and thank you for your help and support and everything that you do in your own career for teachers. Let me start by just saying how this all came about. In the last 15 or 16 months, I've had conversations with teachers in every county in Ohio, and they've had a lot of complaints, but they've also said there are things that work. And when you ask them what's something that would really make a difference in the next 4 years, that would really make a difference both for how you interact with kids, but also what would make a difference for the children themselves, what they will say overwhelmingly is that universal pre-kindergarten, quality universal pre-kindergarten would be a game changer in this state. And the fact of the matter is that it's within our reach because it's doable. If you look at the resources that it would take to implement true universal pre-kindergarten in this state, we have those resources in this state. We just don't have the will to do it. The estimates are that for around $500, $600 million a year, we could do this in this state. And this shouldn't be an issue of Democrats versus Republicans. If you look at the way that this issue has been talked about and implemented, not just discussed, but implemented across the state, or I'm sorry, across the country, it's been done with bipartisan coalitions in many states and in many situations. Because it's not just a partisan issue, and it's not a partisan issue, it's an issue of what actually works. We know that a child starts to develop educationally before kindergarten. We know that. And if you talk to teachers like Anita, they can see a difference in elementary school between children that have had access to high quality pre-kindergarten and those that have not. And currently we're failing our kids because we are not providing that in any kind of comprehensive way in this state. We know that it's a necessity, and if it's an educational necessity, we ought to do something about it. We're lagging the rest of the country when it comes to providing these kinds of opportunities to our kids. Under Governor Kasich, it's only about 2% of kids in Ohio have access to state-funded universal pre-kindergarten. Now, there's kind of a hodgepodge of how people try to get pre-kindergarten. Some people try to pay for it themselves, and a lot of people get left behind in that system. And then there's kind of a variety of ways that people kind of try to fill in the gaps, but there's nothing that's really comprehensive, which is what we know needs to be provided. The sad state of affairs is also that other states are actually implementing these things, and not just Democratic states, by the way. You have states like Oklahoma and Tennessee that are really, again, have put together a bipartisan coalition of both, business and labor, Democrats and Republicans, that realize that this is an investment that makes sense. I think it's also important to note that we're starting our campaign after the primary was over last Tuesday by talking about education. I gave a speech in front of a lot of our teachers last week where I talked about 6 of the principles that we felt it was important to incorporate into a FitzGerald administration. Some of those principles, one of those principles was to actually listen to teachers that are in the classroom 5 days a week before we come up with our education policies. And we're following that in this proposal that we're making today, because this proposal really came out of those conversations with teachers saying what would make a difference. And that's why we're being consistent with that in this proposal today. One of the other 6 principles that I mentioned was, of course, an investment in in universal pre-kindergarten, and that's what we're talking about here today. So the plan that we released earlier today, I'm very proud that this is the first detailed plan that we've released as the campaign progresses. We're going to continue to do that as the year goes on, and I think it says a lot about a candidate and a campaign in terms of what are their first priorities, and this has to be one of our first priorities in this state. So I appreciate folks coming out here today. We're going to continue to talk about this all year long. This is something where we know that it works. We know that Ohio isn't doing well enough, and I'm proud to say it's something that I have a record of making a budgetary priority in Cuyahoga County as well. So when we found extra money in Cuyahoga County's budget, one of the first things we did was we expanded universal pre-kindergarten in Cuyahoga County, and that kind of early investment, I think, is exactly what the state of Ohio needs. We can't be a state where some communities have the resources to make these investments and others do not. That's exactly what the Supreme Court said was unconstitutional way back in 1997. Any parent that can afford this is basically doing this for their child because they know that it works. But we don't want to be a state where some parents can afford the essentials and others are left behind. I'd make one more point, and then if there's any questions, we can take a few questions. There's really 2 different approaches to how to improve that we've seen in the last few years in terms of how to improve student performance. One is the governor's approach, which is largely to have unfunded mandates that are backed up by high-stakes testing. So you just say, well, the best way to make sure that children learn by the 3rd grade is just say, well, you have to learn by the 3rd grade. And you have to improve your reading scores. And if you don't, we're going to hold you back. Hi there. Reminds me of when my children were a little younger, many years ago. And the other approach is to say, well, wait a minute. Yes, we have high aspirations for children, but the best way for children to succeed is not to tell them, you will succeed or else. And we're going to give you an ultimatum. That doesn't work. First of all, it's a way to give the appearance of doing something without actually having to pay for it. But a better way to do it is to say, yes, we believe in the potential of every child, but we've listened to the experts, to the teachers, and we know that the way to get them to succeed by 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade high school is to start getting them on a positive trajectory as early as possible. And this plan, I think, would be a major step in that direction. So thank you for caring enough to come out here, all my friends behind me here, and I'll take a few questions from my friends in front of me.
Well, Ed, we know what the Kasich administration has done with charter schools. Can you tell us what you'd like to do, what direction you'd like to take with charter schools?
Sure. Well, I don't know that everybody knows what the Kasich administration has done with charter schools, but what I can tell you that they've done is they've created an unaccountable system. The ironic thing is that Governor Kasich likes to talk about accountability when it comes to education, but he's unwilling to hold a lot of these for-profit charter schools accountable. So some of them are failing miserably. They are soaking up an enormous amount of tax dollars, and in my opinion, we ought to have much stricter standards when it comes to charter schools, and I don't believe in funding them at the expense of public schools. And part of how you can pay for things that are really impactful is by, I think, cracking down on some of the money that's been wasted in the charter school experiment.
So is that where you would see the funding for a universal preschool program?
I think that's part of it. I think that when you begin your budgetary negotiations, you have a list of what your priorities are, and you put them at the top of the list. I think there are things you can look at in terms of what you've seen in tax policy in the last couple of years. For instance, if you look at the amount of money that was given away in the last few years to tax cuts for people in the top tax bracket, that goes a long way towards paying for it as well. Look, you define your priorities by what you fund, and when the governor ran in 2010, he said his #1 priority was to cut the income tax, and that was basically his #1 budgetary priority. He wasn't very specific about how he was going to fund it. Now, we know now that it was funded by raising the sales tax and by cutting aid to local governments and to education in part. And I would just say if you would have added up over the last 4 years all of the tax giveaways to the top tax bracket, you largely, if not entirely, would have paid for universal pre-kindergarten, and you would have gotten a much bigger return on your money. One of the reasons that CEOs and people from the private sector are so strongly in favor of UPK is that it's a good investment. You get some estimates show as much as a 5 to 1, some estimates as much as 10 to 1 investment on what you invest in universal pre-kindergarten. So in the long run, it will pay for itself. In the short run, I think at a $62 billion budget with an estimate of around $500 million, it's doable. It's doable.
Governor Kasich has put out some ads recently to define what he's done in the past 4 years. They seem to be working. The latest Quinnipiac poll shows him with a 15-point lead. What are you going to do to try to overcome that?
Well, I'd just say that I'm running for governor because of the things I believe in, and this morning is a great example of it. And I didn't wake up one day and say I'm inspired to run for governor because of a poll. And we've had some good polls. There's one a few days ago where we were tied, and there'll be some where we're up and some where we're down, and all that's fine. And we've got 6 months for all that to play out, and I understand there'll be a lot of coverage about that. But what the campaign is going to be about is about ideas and how you move the state forward. And the things that we're talking about here this morning are things that matter, and they're what matter to all the people that are behind me here. And I think that's what will make for a strong campaign. And you will not see any ad from Governor Kasich talking about how he did something really substantive like invest in universal pre-kindergarten for children, because he didn't. So the ads are going to be general and generic and vague because there are not a lot of specific accomplishments to talk about. Just imagine how powerful an ad would have been if Governor Kasich was able to run commercials saying that he had established universal pre-kindergarten in the state of Ohio. Now that would be a difficult opponent to run against, but we don't have that problem because he didn't achieve things like that. So it's a very weak record, and I think the longer the campaign goes on, the more that's going to be reflected in the polls, and it'll be apparent to folks.
questions on the show?
Do you have, are you trying to get more money to fight him? I mean, you've got $8.5 million, you've got $1.5 million. How do you, that's Goliath and Samson, isn't it?
Well, Goliath and Samson. I don't want to correct your biblical knowledge. That would have been an interesting match, I suppose. I think, I don't know who would have won between Goliath and Samson. I don't mean to make fun of you, but I think you meant David and Goliath. But I think again, I don't. If you want to make that comparison, that's fine. I think David won. Again, relying on my universal pre-kindergarten education. I think that's why I learned that. Look, every campaign I've ever been in my life, I have been outspent. Sometimes by 3 to 1, and sometimes 4 to 1. The most powerful thing in politics is not a television commercial. I'm not saying money doesn't matter. We'll have our television commercials soon enough, and I'm not too concerned about that. If you have a message, though, that doesn't speak to the aspirations of the state, like we're doing here this morning, it's a hollow campaign, and you're not giving people real reasons to vote for you and to feel like the state is making progress. If you put money on television, your numbers do typically go up. That is certainly true. But it's not very lasting, and it's not very meaningful if there's not real accomplishments behind it. And what we're talking about here this morning would be a real accomplishment. Look, a few days ago, there were polls that had us, separated by 4 or 5 percentage points. If John Kasich had achieved for the children of Ohio what we're talking about this morning, you wouldn't be able to get close to him because people would feel strongly that he had actually improved the well-being of the average family and the average child in Ohio. But he's not going to be able to talk about those things. So we'll continue to fight for things that we believe in. Like my other campaigns, I'm sure I will be outspent, but like my other campaigns, I think we're ultimately going to be successful.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, folks.